Almost since the creation of Dungeons & Dragons in the 1970s, people have been trying to adapt it into a video game. In fact, with the ubiquity of RPG elements in video games, both casual and hardcore, in the 21st century, it's not a stretch to say that the greatest single influence on all of gaming is Dungeons & Dragons. Some have taken elements of D&D and used them to build their own system of gameplay like the Temple of Apshai or Wizardry, while others are licensed direct adaptations like the Goldbox series or Baldur's Gate. Both styles were popular during the golden age of PC RPGs from roughly 1980 to 2000. By the early 2000s, the market had collapsed, partially due to advances in technology that the PC RPG didn't always keep up with, partially due to changing tastes in video game styles. RPG mechanics gained wider and wider currency, but games directly based on the D&D system were declining, with one notable exception. If you wanted to play a licensed D&D game in the 2000s, the field was dominated by one series: Neverwinter Nights. Neverwinter Nights was developed by BioWare and published by Infogrames for Windows PC on June 18, 2002. Neverwinter Nights is a fantasy RPG based on the 3rd edition rule set of Dungeons & Dragons. The game involves the standard RPG tropes of choosing a class and race, finding items and weapons, fighting monsters, and gathering treasure. Neverwinter Nights can be played from multiple camera angles, including a super close view that awkwardly makes it look like it's a third-person action RPG or a top-down perspective similar to Baldur's Gate. The action is done primarily through pause and play. That is, you freeze the action, make your choices for your character, and then return everything to real time. All of the actions you take in the game are based on D&D die rolls, and the results of those rolls are displayed on screen to see why you succeeded or failed on a hit or action. The game is more action-focused than Planescape Torment or Icewind Dale, with faster fighting and less tactical combat. But it doesn't lose the RPG aspects of character development, speaking to people to learn their troubles, and advancing dialogue paths and reading books to learn the lore of the world. Neverwinter Nights was the hyped-up successor to the previous generation D&D games that was supposed to revolutionize the genre. The game quickly sold over 1 million copies and was showered with critical praise, with one reviewer in Newsweek calling it possibly the richest fantasy PC experience ever created. Did the game actually live up to the acclaim it received? Is it still worth playing today? Let's find out. Neverwinter is a large city in the northeast of Faerun, a continent in the Forgotten Realms, the most important and well-known of D&D's campaign worlds. This wasn't the first time that the city was featured in a video game. In fact, the original Neverwinter Nights was the first massively multiplayer online RPG. Well, the first one that broke out of text-only Mamorpagas and actually displayed graphics. The plot sees you as a lowly level 1 adventurer who is trapped inside Neverwinter because of a quarantine imposed on the city. A terrible plague has been raging for weeks, causing a gloomy, gritty atmosphere. Everyone is afraid of death, doomsayers prophesying the death of everyone are on the street corners. The government is paralyzed and no one knows what to do. You step in to save the day, eventually curing the plague, tracking down the creatures that spread it in the first place, and saving the town and the surrounding area from a dire threat. Unfortunately, the original campaign for Neverwinter Nights does not live up to expectations or descriptions. The opening chapter is the best part of the game. Its darkness and misery with claustrophobia setting in upon being trapped in a diseased hellhole is palpably exciting. But that's only a short burst of the game. Subsequent chapters find you in a pleasant Sylvan setting with bog-standard elves and orcs. The drive and urge to stop the plague evaporates as you traverse a much more pleasant, less inspired set of fantasy tropes. Neverwinter itself is a medieval Europe setting, the most boring and traditional of fantasy settings. The land of Neverwinter and its environs do not really impress on a storytelling level. The world is pretty basic. The secret of the plague, by the way, is laughable. The terrible villain of the campaign, the grand threat to civilization, the potential destroyer of worlds, is a lizard. Well, a lizard man. Well, that's a female lizard man. Or a lizard lady, maybe? Who's trying to take over the world. It's a blasé story with a compelling beginning that fails to impress at the rising action phase. And after that it collapses. We're supposed to be dealing with mighty events that shake the very foundations of the universe. Messing about with gods in Baldur's Gate 2 or the concepts of humanity and change itself in Planescape Torment. Here you have to kill a lizard. Whoop-de-doo. In both the original Neverwinter Nights and its sequel, the opening campaign is strangely the weakest story they release, and only interesting as a jumping-off point for better stories later. Problem with this campaign is that it's too focused on pen-and-paper style RPG stories or plots. In those games, this would be a perfectly acceptable starting point to a campaign for first-level characters. However, a video game needs to function differently. Chasing down rats and killing a goblin or three is not acceptable. It's a waste of time for players. You're writing a plot to a video game that has to compete with all of the other grandiose stories in gaming. You can't sell a weak sauce starter campaign to people for $60. It seems designed to be a beginning story that is expanded upon in later expansion packs. Not cool, BioWare. Think of another BioWare game, Dragon Age Origins. The introduction for the first few minutes is kinda cliché and not satisfying, but within an hour you're camping with the Grey Wardens and chasing down hideous-looking Darkspawn in a crazy bog, and the country is believably threatened with destruction you can witness. The story should be epic from the off, not basic until you pay more money. You only seem to make it up to the mid-teens level-wise during the entire campaign. In D&D, especially 2nd edition, that's a huge level gain. But a video game, you're still not charging up to extraordinary power. At the end of the original campaign, you feel like a somewhat middling character. Mirroring the tenor of the game itself, you reach a ho-hum, so-so level of strength. This is a ho-hum, middle-of-the-road kind of story. Not really worth writing home about. Again, perfectly fine for a pen-and-paper game played with friends over months and months, but other video games had you becoming all-powerful godlike beings in Wizardry 8, or fighting ultra-powerful Godzilla monsters in Final Fantasy VII. You have to adjust D&D to the world of video games, or you'll just find yourself wanting more from your campaign. The characters are nothing to write home about either. Some are vaguely interesting, such as Arabeth de Tilmaran, but nothing compared to truly great characters in the Baldur's Gate series like the tiefling Herr Dallas or the hilarious Minsk and Boo. The villain is dull, your character has virtually no space for depth or choice, you're pretty much shoved along with the story whether you like it or not, and the world is pretty basic. Even for someone not jaded with RPGs like I am, it would be underwhelming. Almost everything in the original campaign is not worth remembering, really. But what about the setting, the way the game looks, and the visual design? Is that any redeeming factor? Visually, Neverwinter Nights looks, well, let's get this over with, terrible. The cutscenes, if you can call them that, are abysmal clips of regular gameplay with Z-grade voice acting. They don't even try to make any cutscenes, really, and the regular gameplay isn't spectacular looking either. In the late 90s, the main D&D licensed products like Icewind Dale or Planescape Torment used a top-down isometric perspective with pre-rendered backgrounds. It was like having a painting on the floor representing the room you were in and watching little action figures walk across it. The style allowed for beautiful drawings rich with stylization. You couldn't move the camera or zoom in, but what you had was excellent visually. But Neverwinter Nights was a different game. It could still be played from a top-down, more or less top-down perspective, but it was now a three-dimensional game. You had camera control and could spin it around and look anywhere you want or zoom in really close to your character. But why would you want to? The visuals of Neverwinter Nights are more impressive than their predecessors, but much in the same way that Superman 64 is technically more impressive than, say, Rystar. One is a beautiful 2D platformer with excellent backgrounds and adorable characters, while the other is, well, it's 3D and it looks hideous. I had to experience a lot of this stuff as a kid during the great change from 2D to 3D in the mid-90s console years. We went from the most advanced and artistic era of side-scrolling 2D graphics with rich, beautiful colors to the most primitive and pathetic-looking three-dimensional graphics. The buildings, the monsters, the main characters, and well, just about everything is a hideous polygonal mess. The faces in particular are weird, dismal blobs with static faces stretched over them, and the heads twitch sometimes. Oh god, why do they twitch? Every character looks like a slow-mo Valtiel from Silent Hill 3. Is that supposed to represent them talking? Why is it happening? It creeps me out. The buildings have no character and seem vague and ill-defined. Virtually everything in the game is bare bones, smooth, and dull. It reminds me of why I don't care for modern Pixar-styled animated movies compared to the old-fashioned animated films. Every character is too flat, clean, and smooth. There's no personality or depth in any drawing. It's a sanitized image of a character with none of the real artist's input visible. The whole thing makes the game difficult, if not impossible, to appreciate visually. But I've played plenty of games that looked worse, even wizardry games with wireframe graphics. But those games at least had some kind of depth and skill put into monster design, whereas games made many years later, the enemies sort of pale in comparison. There was simply more style and ability in a game made in the mid-80s than one from the early 2000s for some reason. An identical process happened during the creation of Wizardry 8. You now had a fully 3D wizardry world you could walk around in and enjoy with monsters dynamically wandering about the dungeon. However, it's coupled with the most basic, dismal, and lackluster 3D graphics. The previous game, Wizardry 7, came out 10 years earlier, and the monster design, because there was actual design and art put into it, looked substantially better. So to enjoy the Neverwinter Nights series, you'll have to put your visual concerns on the shelf. I mean, for heaven's sakes, Halo, the original Halo, came out a year before Neverwinter Nights, and these games look 20 years apart easily. It's simply not pretty to look at. But that really doesn't matter at all compared to how it plays. The images are nice and all, but they can be easily forgiven and forgotten if actually playing the game is well made. Luckily for Neverwinter Nights, they did an excellent job on that front. The era immediately preceding Neverwinter Nights in the D&D world was the best of times and the worst of times. Baldur's Gate and Planescape Torment had some of the best characters, setting, music, and stories ever seen in an RPG, and yet something was lacking. Something elusive, something not quite present. Yes, that's what it was, actually playing the darn game! As well written and enjoyable as the worlds were, getting down to the brass tacks of really playing the game is frustrating and unpleasant. Fighting is clunky, takes a very long time, and it's very hard to maneuver people across the map in or out of combat. The character interface is terrible, with a tiny fixed number of slots divided up among 6 characters. Picking up anything is often irritating. Just ensuring that every character can get across the damn map without being stuck on something is a chore. Neverwinter Nights, on the other hand, radically changed things. To start with, you no longer create a party, you only create one character for the whole game. This was highly unusual for a D&D-based game. Dungeons & Dragons is a game designed for a group to play. A standard party holds between 4 and 6 characters. Everything in the game, from speaking to people to fighting monsters to gathering items to traveling, is made for a diverse set of people with a wide variety of skills, races, feats, and classes to pool their abilities in order to solve problems. This may originate in The Lord of the Rings, published in 1954 and a foundational work in creating modern fantasy. The Fellowship of the Ring is a diverse group of people who all bring their own uniqueness to the task of completing an adventure. But in Neverwinter Nights, you're completely alone at first, just one adventurer against the world, and that's a major issue with this game. Early on, if you're playing a warrior character, you're probably fine, but if you're a weakling like a mage or rogue, you're in trouble. You can't carry anything worth a damn, and for a spellcaster, the entire point of your character class is to use spells from behind a wall of burly protectors who absorb damage and busy the enemy while you're safe. It's more challenging than it needs to be early on. And there are some serious issues with the leveling up. There are too many skills in the game. For instance, there are 3 types of persuade skill: persuade, intimidate, and bluff. That should just be one type of skill. It's too many in a video game to match it exactly what it's like in D&D. And there's no reason disarm trap and set trap should be 2 separate skills. It should just be the setting the trap. And you shouldn't have move silently and hide as 2 separate skills. That should just be one skill of hiding in shadows. It's too complicated. There's too much to do there. Also, there's something odd about the feats. I like them, and I especially like the epic level feats you get in the later expansions, but you can't see what feats you need as part of an organized list as you go. So unless you have the wiki out and know exactly what you need for each individual feat, it's not going to appear there. For instance, if you want improved two-handed fighting, you'd have to know that you have to have a certain dexterity score and get a couple of other things in order to get it. It's not apparent there. You have to know it beforehand and match it. That's a little too complicated, and they should have a grayed out area where they'd show you what you need eventually later on in the game to get that, just to make it simpler. Skill usage is affected as well. There are dozens of skills you could learn to help progress the game, like lockpicking, disarming traps, or persuading people. But sadly, if you picked a character without access to them, they are essentially lost without major stat and maybe feat investment to make it practical, instead of being something a fellow adventurer might have because he chose a different class or race. The game does allow you to bring along a hireling, but it's just one lone person who could easily die if you're not careful, and you have very little control over them. You can sort of tell them how to fight a bit or where to stand next to you, but that's really the end. You can't look in their inventory or tell them what to equip, and you can't take direct control of them, which is a huge issue. This is a terrible, terrible choice. For precise moments, you really need to be able to take direct control of someone. Especially, this doesn't make any sense if your main character is not a tank. In D&D, you have to have a tough character out front. The warrior, the barbarian, the fighter, paladin, whatever, he has to be up in the front lines, not you, and yet you can only control your character, so you end up being the one in front all the time. You can't be the one opening the doors, checking the locks, looking places, and being the first into combat. If you're a wizard, you're going to get yourself killed almost immediately. It's ridiculous. They'll level up along with you, but you don't have any control about how they level up. The entire system seems like part of a worrying trend of narcissism in some modern gaming. The games are more and more inward focused on the struggles of a single person rather than the adventure of a group. Take a game that came out a little under a year before Neverwinter Nights, Wizardry 8. Here was a perfect modernization of the classic PC RPG game. You created 6 characters, and eventually could get 2 hirelings so you could have 8 total, and guided everything about them from start to finish. Why do games so often leave a pre-created party for you? I always hated that. It's much more fun to make your own party and get some internal role-playing going on. But in Neverwinter Nights, it's just one dude and his buddy that he can barely command effectively. The game would have been so much better with a group, and later Neverwinter Nights expansion packs and community-made modules expanded on the games, making a standard number of party members of 3 or more. And they allowed you to pick that character's inventory, thank God. But even then, you still can't level them up on your own. It's terrible. Are people just lazy about doing that? Creating characters is the most fun I have with some games, and I have a control freak's desire to make them to my exact specifications. It's a worrying trend in games, and something that really makes me like the old school better, and something that Neverwinter Nights was not a part of. The rest of the transition to Neverwinter Nights is excellent. The game adopts what was then the brand new 3rd edition of Dungeons & Dragons, and I'm quite happy about that. Mirroring the video game landscape, the pen and paper RPG worlds of Dungeons & Dragons were superior in artistry, creativity, style, and especially world building during the 2nd edition or advanced Dungeons & Dragons era. The company preferred to create and build exciting new landscapes to play like Ravenloft or Dark Sun within the existing framework of the game, while 3rd edition and much of D&D afterward has become multiple attempts at improving the gameplay while arguably leaving the world building in the dust. Even though I started out playing D&D 2nd edition, I much prefer 3rd edition. It's simpler, easier on beginning players, and more fun all around. The interface is mostly clear, inventory management can still be a bit of a hassle, but I actually enjoy it. It's kind of relaxing to sort through all the stuff you picked up at the end of a match. But it's a much simpler Diablo-style backpack you can pull up any time without transitioning to another screen. I actually enjoy sorting through all of my items and putting them in the separate areas I want to after I spend hours in a dungeon, and I like to look over all I have. It's actually kind of enjoyable. It's hard to describe without actually playing it, but Neverwinter Nights has a more free, intuitive, and fun system of play. I don't feel like I'm fighting against the controls in order to move. Everything in the Baldur's Gate or Goldbox game seems to be stuck in slow motion, or driving down a road with debris in your way crashing against you. Leveling up is much more forgiving, and you feel like you get stronger faster in 3rd edition. Multiclassing also makes much more sense compared to the craziness of AD&D. Just pick something you're qualified for and go. New classes were added for 3rd edition, including my beloved Barbarian. Any game that allows me to let loose my inner Conan is good in my book. Choosing skills, feats, and spells is more straightforward than in AD&D. From using potions or casting spells from hotkeys or switching weapons, everything in the game is just plain easier. Combat, as I said, is an easy-to-manage pause-and-play system. You don't need to, but if you ever need to stop the action to think or plan your move, just hit the spacebar. As with any system based on a roll of the dice, you'll spend a lot of the game swinging and missing your enemies. It's a little irritating when logically it seems like right next to you can't miss again and again, but you do anyway. I also find myself feeling like I should try to dodge or run away from battle when I'm getting my ass handed to me, but I'm deceiving myself. You can't suddenly react to trouble because you'll provoke attacks of opportunity. And if something is going to hit you, the die roll of it hitting you has already been done before you dash to safety, and you'll probably die anyway. Battles are much less strategic than they were in the past. You don't have much room for strategy with only 2 people, after all. Fights tend to be much easier than they were in the AD&D-based games like Planescape Torment. You'll die less frequently and win, often simply by charging into battle. Some people, like myself, will prefer that to the tougher Baldur's Gate system, while others will be disappointed it's so much easier. You'll have to decide what you like on your own. Shadows of Untitled is the first major expansion pack for Neverwinter Nights, released on June 21, 2003. The expansion included prestige classes like the Assassin and the Blackguard, adding much-needed richness to the character building process. The prestige classes make higher-level characters much more interesting and diverse. Aside from that, though, there is very little expansion on the gameplay. It plays pretty much like the original. The story of Shadows of Untitled is superior to the original campaign. You start out in a tiny village, a mediocre standard setting for any game. The first act is rather dull in setting and tone to me, and it involves fighting the same low-level enemies like kobolds and so forth. Although it does involve a really cool NPC that's a heck of a lot of fun, but I don't want to spoil that. The game picks up in the 2nd and 3rd sections, though. The 2nd section, called the Interlude, takes you to an ancient Egypt-style desert complete with Bedouin and mummies. And the final act sees the most interesting section trapped inside a lost desert city, forced to work for a deranged lizard-man slave trader. I found the final villain, her boss fight, the setting, and the level design much better than the original campaign. It came to feel more like a dungeon crawler at the end, and I appreciated that over the boring woodland or urban settings of the original. Unfortunately, the expansion is also worse in several ways. First, the opening is, as mentioned, dull, with the first third of the game being a bit of a slog. And the abysmal NPC system has got even worse. The original campaign at least offered you a robust collection of classes and races to play with. But Untitled gives you just 2 hirelings and they are both multi-classed. One is a thief/cleric, the other is a sorcerer-barbarian. Yeah, those things do not effectively multi-class together. And the barbarian is going to be using spells left and right, so if you're a wizard, you're both going to be using spells, even if you tell him just be a barbarian. You can tell either NPC to exclusively level up as one or the other class, and I strongly recommend doing that, but you have to know to do that in the dialogue screen. If you miss that, you'll lose several valuable levels to a pointless class. The expansion is shorter than the original campaign, but better, and it might behoove a starter player to begin here instead of the tiresome Neverwinter plot. Ah, here we go. After multiple expansions and over a year since the original game comes the true version of Neverwinter Nights, Hordes of the Underdark. Hordes of the Underdark was released on December 2nd, 2003, and finally gave Neverwinter Nights fans the game they were looking for. Hordes of the Underdark is set sometime after the events of the original game, and you take on the role of the hero who saved Neverwinter, or the hero of Untitled, when you're summoned to help the Lords of Waterdeep fight an incursion of Dark Elves and Beholders. Right away, the game is superior to the original. You start out at about level 15 and extend into epic levels later on, truly becoming a badass. I know you miss out on the weakness of being a level 1 nobody and becoming all-powerful, which is an important aspect of a lot of role-playing games. But it's better than starting out as level 1 and becoming middle-of-the-road like the first 2 Neverwinter Nights experiences. The game includes several really cool prestige classes, including my favorite, the Red Dragon Disciple for the Sorcerer and Bard, adding yet more richness to the character design. It's surprising how important little fundamental details of aesthetics and tone are important to making the game more useful for your internalized role-playing. The more you can design who your character is and the less of a box they put you in, the better the game gets. The story takes several unexpected twists, leading you to the legendary dungeon of Undermountain, to the wicked tunnels of the Underdark, and even crossing the plains themselves by the end. Unlike the forgettable quests in the original game, Hordes includes several excellent stories and settings, including a subterranean cult of the undead terrorizing the Underdark, a group of renegade drow who forswear evil in favor of kindness and good, and my personal favorite of this game, and one of the best in any of the role-playing games I've ever played, is a strange collection of golems who have broken their programming and want to live free as sentient creatures. I love the overall campaign, the side quests, and many of the characters are great too, including an NPC is from Sigil in Planescape, perfect for me. I rarely go back to the original game these days, preferring to play Hordes if I get a hankering for Neverwinter Nights. It's the best the series has to offer. Well, officially it's the best. Unofficially, as good as Hordes is, it's still beaten by a wide margin by a game not even made by BioWare, but by an independent fan of the games using the glorious Aurora toolset. Plenty of games in the past have had a level editor. It goes way back to the early PC games that you could use to design your own levels and make the game almost limitless, like the great ZZT. Neverwinter Nights included with it a powerful level builder called the Aurora toolset, allowing fans to make entire campaigns on their own. You could spend years or thousands of hours, and many did, lovingly crafting expansive worlds down to the tiniest detail. The godlike power to make your own world and fill it with anything you like are at your command. One of the essential additions is the massive Community Expansion Pack, or CEP, which added a ton of new stuff, including paintings, textures, music, weapons, and everything you need to expand your game-making skills. Dozens of fan-made projects were put up on the now-defunct Neverwinter Vault. Well, it's still put up, but not by BioWare anymore, but by fans. They're still online today, and they can make your Neverwinter Nights experience even better, and extend the game's playability far beyond what you would have expected without it. A number of the fan-made campaigns are even better than the original, but none, in my humble opinion, are as good as the Saga of Aeland. Aeland follows the player character all the way from level 1 to the astounding mid-30s of levels, putting them beyond demigod status. I can't say much without spoiling anything, but the story starts you as a humble traveler in a waterlogged rural town, takes you to the heights of royal intrigue, and eventually leads you to an apocalyptic battle involving gods, demons, angels, and the secret history of the galaxy's true overlords. Are you listening, BioWare? This is the kind of story you should have automatically included in the base game. I truly grew fond of the people, the cities, the kingdoms, and the world of Aeland. If you're going to check out Neverwinter Nights, I'd highly recommend the Saga of Aeland for the characters, the world building, the quests, and one of the best adventures I've ever had in any RPG. Overall, I'm very happy with Neverwinter Nights despite its flaws. Its level design, combat, inventory management, leveling system make the game much easier to play on a technical level compared to its predecessors. However, that comes along with a dark side. Focusing on a single adventurer rather than a party cheapens the D&D experience almost beyond recognition, and the visual side of things is weak at best. You also don't have a visually weak game like Wizardry 8, but was an incredible story. This one just has really good gameplay, and pretty much everything else is not very good. Who am I kidding? The game is wretched to look at, but it's damn fun to play at least, especially when, as is increasingly the case in the modern age, fans take a video game as a jumping-off point to refine and perfect, with the benefit of years of development the creators never had. I'm probably going to be playing this game for many years now, if only to play the fan-made mods instead of the regular game. BioWare continued releasing the smaller-scale mini-expansions for many years until the release of Neverwinter Nights 2 on Halloween 2006. Could the game build upon the lessons of the first game, fix problems, expand the world, and make D&D great again? Or would it be an even messier, more conflicting, and ultimately unpleasant experience? We'll find out next time when we conclude this miniseries on Neverwinter Nights.